This is a CBS News special report. I'm Michelle Miller in New York. There has been a mass shooting at a synagogue in Pittsburgh. News reports at the scene say that as many as 8 people are dead. Police have yet to confirm that. They have told us the shooter is in custody, that there are multiple casualties, and that 3 police officers were shot at the scene. They are still searching the building and they were asking at that point in time before we were told that the suspect was taken into custody, that folks should still shelter in place. This is in Squirrel Hill. It's a neighborhood of Pittsburgh. Right now, we're going to head to our CBS News Justice and Homeland Security correspondent, Jeff Pegues. He is on the phone with us now. And Jeff, I know we don't have a lot of information at this time, but I have to ask, what indication do we have that this may have been a hate crime?
Well, when you have a situation like this where a house of worship is targeted in this way, that rises obviously to the top of the list in terms of what investigators will look at. But right now, the focus, Michelle, is of course making sure that the scene is secure. And that's why you have law enforcement in Pittsburgh advising people in that area to shelter in place for a couple of reasons. They don't want the public to be in any type of situation where they could get injured and add to the casualty list. And, of course, law enforcement is at work here. So they're telling people in the area to shelter in place as they figure out exactly what's going on. Of course, as you reported, there is a suspect in custody, but that does not allow law enforcement to let their guard down. They can't just go on the thinking that it's just one suspect. It may be more than one suspect, and so they have to operate that way. And that's why you have them telling people in that area to shelter in place. As you reported, the shooter is in custody. That's a good thing, perhaps. The number of injured and potentially the fatalities will not rise, but it's still early, Michelle, in this process. There is still obviously a lot of investigating to do, and investigators will look to see if there are any booby traps, because what we've seen in past active shooter situations, there have been cases where the shooters have not only come armed with guns, but also with explosive devices. And so investigators and the responding law enforcement, the first responders on the scene, are going to have to secure the scene before they can really start investigating this case.
Jeff, I'm sorry for interrupting, but this strikes me as an event very similar to what was taking place shortly after the Boston Marathon bombing. And I have to ask you whether or not you think that police, in many respects, are taking on some of the same tactics in locking down the neighborhood there in Pittsburgh as we saw taking place live on video back then.
Well, listen, the unfortunate thing is that these active shooter situations are happening more frequently. As a result of that, law enforcement has become better trained in how to respond to situations like this. Really, this phenomenon, if you will, started with Columbine. And there were mistakes made looking back during the response to Columbine, and that law enforcement didn't move in fast enough to neutralize the shooters. And so in subsequent years of training, investigators have learned that you don't wait to respond to an active shooter situation. You move in immediately. And so the first arriving officers on the scene have been trained to move in immediately. In fact, this was something we saw with Parkland. Remember, when Parkland unfolded, there was the officer on the scene who did not go in fast enough. he did not respond to the shooting fast enough, and he was criticized for that.
Okay, Jeff,
and so there have been lessons learned from previous active shootings, Michelle.
Yeah, Jeff, I wanted to go now to the tweet that President Trump just released on his social media. He tweeted, watching the events unfolding in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, law enforcement on the scene. People in Squirrel Hill area should remain sheltered. Looks like multiple fatalities. Beware of active shooter. God bless all. Obviously, the president is reaching out to his base, his Twitter followers, to let them know what is taking place. But we don't know a lot at this point in time. We know that this took place at a synagogue, and we know that at least one suspect is now in custody. Jeff, when you think about the person who is now in custody, what is law enforcement doing with that individual at this particular point in time, based on what you know of these instances very similar to this in the past?
Well, you're trying to get as much information out of this person as possible. Why did this person do this? Are there any other people involved? What motivated the attack? I mean, you're trying to get really basic questions answered at this point. Obviously, this is a fluid situation. We know that there are multiple casualties inside the building. There are officers shot and injured, we're told, and investigators are still searching the building. And so they're going to want to get as much information out of him as possible. In many of these cases, the shooter does not survive active shooting situations. So when you have one who survives, you go back to basics and essentially get as much information out of them as possible, Michelle.
Of course, this is coming on the heels of the arrests made in the suspicious packages mail bomb scare. Just yesterday, there was an individual who was arrested by police. How much are law enforcement authorities looking at the possibility of, copycatters in some respect when you think of the threat to the general public or threats to specific people here?
That is always a factor. Unfortunately, when you have as many active shooters situation as we've seen in this country over the last several years, you tend to have copycat incidents because people see the attention incidents like these get, and sadly it motivates them to take action. And that's why you have a concerted effort on the part of law enforcement to try to stop these acts before they unfold. In fact, I've done some reporting on the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which looks into cases like active shooters, trying to build a profile of what these active shooters look like, where they come from, what motivates them to act, the age range. And what is interesting here, based on what I've learned in my research on this issue, there really is no clear pattern in terms of an age of these active shooters. They come from all walks of life, which makes it difficult. But also, what the FBI has told me is that a lot of people who come in contact with people who do things like this, they may confront these people, but they never tell law enforcement, hey, look out for so-and-so because I think they're heading down a dangerous path. And so in a lot of these cases, you'll have people who have come in contact with people who carry out acts like this, and yet they don't notify authorities. And so there is a lot of research that the FBI and other groups are trying to do to look into these active shooter situations because in an effort to try to prevent them or try to reverse this trend of active shooter situations. And the FBI feels like the word is getting out. There has been progress made, but clearly this is another incident that shows that there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of notifying people when they see someone who perhaps is in a situation where they are feeling and preparing for some sort of outburst, whether it's an active shooter situation or some sort of violence that puts other people in danger.
Jeff, we should note that our viewers are looking at pictures from our affiliate KDKA in Pittsburgh, an incredible police presence. We see fire on the scene. We see police. It appears that we see even state police on the scene, certainly the city of Pittsburgh. To recap, there has been a mass shooting at a synagogue in Pittsburgh. Reports at the scene say that as many as 8 people are dead. Police confirm the shooter is in custody and that there are multiple casualties. 3 police officers were shot at the scene. We should note they are still searching the building and that people in the area should shelter in place. Again, this is in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh. Stay with CBS News for the very latest throughout the day, and you can get complete coverage on our streaming network, CBSN. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Michelle Miller in New York.